attention to the education of Master Jack. Reading and writing she undertook to teach herself, while she entrusted the instruction in arithmetic to the care of Dick Sands. Under the conviction that a child of 5 years will make a much more rapid progress if something like amusement be combined with his lessons, Mrs. Weldon would not teach her boy to spell by the use of an ordinary school primer, but used a set of cubes, on the sides of which the various letters were painted in red. After first making a word and showing it to Jack, she set him to put it together without her help, and it was astonishing how quickly the child advanced, and how many hours he would spend in this way both in the cabin and on deck. There were more than 50 cubes, which, beside the alphabet, included all the digits, so that they were of service for Dick Sands' lessons as well as of her own. She was more than satisfied with her device. On the morning of the 9th, an incident occurred which could not fail to be observed as somewhat remarkable. Jack was half lying, half sitting on the deck, amusing himself with his letters, and had just finished putting together a word with which he intended to puzzle old Tom, who, with his hands sheltering his eyes, was pretending not to see the difficulty with which was being laboriously prepared to bewilder him. All at once Dingo, who had been gambolling around the child, made a sudden pause, lifted his right paw, and wagged his tail convulsively. Then, darting down upon a capital S, he seized it in his mouth, and carried it some paces away. "Oh, Dingo, Dingo, you mustn't eat my letters!" shouted the child. But the dog had already dropped the block of wood, and coming back again, picked up another, which he laid quietly by the side of the first. This time it was a capital V. Jack uttered an exclamation of astonishment, which brought to his side not only his mother, but the captain and Dick, who were both on deck. In answer to their inquiry as to what had occurred, Jack cried out in the greatest excitement that Dingo knew how to read. At any rate, he was sure that he knew his letters. Dick Sands smiled and stooped to take back the letters. Dingo snarled and showed his teeth, but the apprentice was not frightened. He carried his point, and replaced the two blocks among the rest. Dingo in an instant pounced upon them again, and having drawn them to his side, laid a paw upon each of them, as if to signify his intention of retaining them in his possession. Of the other letters of the alphabet he took no notice at all. "It is very strange," said Mrs. Weldon. "He has picked out S.V. again." "S.V.!" repeated the captain thoughtfully. "Are not those the letters that form the initials of his collar?" And turning to the old negro, he continued, "Tom, didn't you say that this dog did not always belong to the captain of the Waldeck?" "To the best of my belief," replied Tom. "The captain had only had him about 2 years. I often heard him tell how he had found him at the mouth of the Congo." "Do you suppose that he never knew where the animal came from, or to whom he had previously belonged?" asked Captain Hall. "Never," answered Tom, shaking his head. "A lost dog is worse to identify than a lost child. You see, he can't make himself understood any way." The captain made no answer, but stood musing. Mrs. Weldon interrupted him. "These letters, captain, seem to be recalling something to your recollection?" "I can hardly go so far as to say that, Mrs. Weldon," he replied, "but I cannot help associating them with the fate of a brave explorer." "Whom do you mean?" said the lady. "In 1871, just 2 years ago," the captain continued, "a French traveller, under the auspices of the Geographical Society of Paris, set out for the purpose of crossing Africa from west to east. His starting point was the mouth of the Congo, and his exit was designed to be as near as possible to Cape Delgado, at the mouth of the river Rovuma, of which he was to ascertain the true course. The name of this man was Samuel Vernon, and I confess it strikes me as somewhat a strange coincidence that the letters engraved on Dingo's collar should be Vernon's initials." "Is nothing known about this traveller?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "Nothing was ever heard of him after his first departure. It appears quite certain that he failed to reach the east coast, and it can only be conjectured either that he died upon his way, or that he was made prisoner by the natives; and if so, and this dog ever belonged to him, the animal might have made his way back to the sea coast, where, just about the time that would be likely, the captain of the Waldeck picked him up." "But you have no reason to suppose, Captain Hall, that Vernon ever owned a dog of this description." "I own I never heard of it," said the captain; "but still the impression fixes itself on my mind that the dog must have been his. How he came to know one letter from another, it is not for me to pretend to say. Look at him now, madam; he seems not only to be reading the letters for himself, but to be inviting us to come and read them with him." Whilst Mrs. Weldon was watching the dog with such amusement, Dick Sands, who had listened to the previous conversation, took the opportunity of asking the captain whether the traveller Vernon had started on his expedition quite alone. "That is really more than I can tell you, my boy," answered Captain Hall; "but I should almost take it for granted that he would have a considerable retinue of natives." The captain spoke without being aware that Negoro had meanwhile quietly stolen on deck. At first his presence was quite unnoticed, and no one observed the peculiar glance with which he looked at the two letters over which Dingo still persisted in keeping guard. The dog, however, no sooner caught sight of the cook than he began to bristle with rage, whereupon Negoro, with a threatening gesture which seemed half involuntary, withdrew immediately to his accustomed quarters. The incident did not escape the captain's observation. "No doubt," he said, "there is some mystery here," and he was pondering the matter over in his mind when Dick Sands spoke. "Don't you think it very singular, sir, that this dog should have such a knowledge of the alphabet?" Jack here put in his word. "My mamma has told me about a dog whose name was Munito, who could read as well as a schoolmaster, and could play dominoes." Mrs. Weldon smiled. "I am afraid, my child, that that dog was not quite so learned as you imagine. I don't suppose he knew one letter from another, but his master, who was a clever American, had found out that the animal had a very keen sense of hearing, taught him some curious tricks." "What sort of tricks?" asked Dick, who was almost as much interested as little Jack. "When he had to perform in public," continued Mrs. Weldon, "a lot of letters like yours, Jack, were spread out upon a table, and Munito would put together any word that the company should propose, either aloud or in a whisper, to his master. The creature would walk about until he stopped at the very letter which was wanted. The secret of all was that the dog's owner gave him a signal when he was to stop by rattling a little toothpick in his pocket, making a slight noise that only the dog's ears were acute enough to perceive." Dick was highly amused, and said, "But that was a dog who could do nothing wonderful without his master." "Just so," answered Mrs. Weldon, "and it surprises me very much to see Dingo picking out these letters without a master to direct him." "The more one thinks of it, the more strange it is," said Captain Hall. "But after all, Dingo's sagacity is not greater than that of the dog which rang the convent bell in order to get at the dish that was reserved for passing beggars, nor than that of the dog who had to turn a spit every other day, and never could be induced to work when it was not his proper day. Dingo evidently has no acquaintance with any other letters except the two S.V., and some circumstance which we can never guess has made him familiar with them." "What a pity he cannot talk!" exclaimed the apprentice. "We should know why it is that he always shows his teeth at Negoro." "And tremendous teeth they are," observed the captain, as Dingo at that moment opened his mouth and made a display of his formidable fangs. End of Part the First. Chapter 5. Recording by Alex Heetelander, Davis, California. www.alexheetelander.com